Okay, I think we should start because otherwise we eat up your time, Sonia. Yeah, welcome back from the lunch break. Happy to have you back all, and I hope that you had good food for thought out of 3 sessions and 1 keynote. And yeah, and I also like to welcome our second keynote, Sonja Blignaut from South Africa. Welcome. Nice to have you here. And Sonja, you are a wayfinding partner. You help people to feel comfortable in complexity. And as you told me, you developed also a program that makes people or organizations fit for complexity. And diversity is one dimension in all this. And you will tell us today how much diversity is linked to complexity and vice versa. And well, the stage is yours. We are curious. Nice to have you.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Tobias. And I love speaking to curious people. So thank you for saying that you're curious. Yes, thank you so much. It's such a privilege for me to be here with you guys today, especially regarding this topic. I saw on the conference brochure that it says I'm an expert in diversity. I think maybe that expertise is more of a lived expertise than an academic one, but I've been working in the field of complexity now for 20 years. So that's kind of my primary lens. And then also linked to complexity, because, the way that you understand complex human systems is through narrative and story. So I've done several narrative research projects over the years. So I'll be sharing some of the results that we found in some recent projects linked to diversity and belonging with you as well. So I think I'm just going to jump straight in and start sharing my screen. And just tell me if you're not able to see them or to see it. So what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is how to reframe diversity from a problem to solve to an asset to nurture. And I think where I want to start is with a story of my own. So as you've heard, I'm from South Africa. And in a way, I have lived with the complexities of diversity all my life. I think the South African story, and especially our history, is very well known. And I have experienced kind of, the pain of being confronted with the effects of my privilege and also the blindness that comes with privilege. I've been confronted with the pain of not feeling that I belong anymore with, others who look and sound like me. And then I've also been confronted with unconscious bias, my own, but I've also been on the receiving end of the unconscious bias of others. And so I've seen the pain and I've seen the conflict. And in particular, I've seen the damage that happens when we oversimplify diversity, and very often with the very best of intentions, we implement quite mechanistic solutions that focus on numbers or on training or learning and information. And I've also seen the opposite. I've seen the beauty and the power of diversity and what can happen when we embrace it kind of in its full glory and its full messiness. And I think that's why this topic matters so much to me, because it's time that we reframe our thinking, our language, and also our approaches to diversity. And I think what I'm hoping to get across today is that the reasons for this is not only from an empathy or some people would refer to this as soft or touchy-feely perspective. There are some really hard business consequences if we don't value diversity in a complex world. And so I want to start just by, laying the foundation around what I mean when I talk about complexity. And I want to distinguish between two different words and two different kinds of systems. And this is complicated versus complex. And I think what happens, especially if, like me, English is not my first language. And I find that we use complex and complicated very much interchangeably. But today I want to highlight the difference between these two. So the image on screen, is you'll see on the left-hand side is of quite an intricate fold. It's almost like origami. And so that word complicated, the root word plik, means folded or enfolded. So a key thing with a complicated system or a complicated problem is I can unfold it, I can break it into its parts, I can fully understand it, and then I can replicate it. So if I have a problem that presents as a complicated problem, there's a solution that I can find, and once I've found it, the problem remains solved. And I solve it through analysis, through engineering approaches. Very often, this is where I can be quite reductionistic. But then if I move to complexity, that word plex means entangled or woven together. And the image on your screen is of brain neurons. So I cannot fully understand your brain. I can't understand your personality. I can't understand consciousness by trying to untangle your brain. And even now we know that consciousness, for example, is not even only situated in our brains. It's distributed through our bodies and into our environments. And so complexity is a very different kind of a system. It's messy, it's tangled, and I can never fully know it. And problems that I encounter, they present as patterns. They don't present as problems that can be solved. And so with that in mind, what I've seen is very often what we do is we treat diversity as if it's a complicated problem that can be solved with engineering solutions versus a complex pattern. And how this very often manifests, and I love this image on screen, it's by an artist who wrote a book, The Art of the Cleanup. I really, if you can find the book, it's really awesome. But we tend to create crude categories, so we categorize people very often according to their visible diversity characteristics. And then we create quite superficial interventions, mostly focused around education. So we want to teach people more about, how people from other diversity spaces, how they see the world, or we focus on compliance and numbers. And when we do this, we oversimplify because awareness and knowledge is not enough. For me to simply be aware of why somebody from a different race group or somebody from a different gender does something or thinks in a certain way does not mean that it will automatically remove my bias. And if I make diversity about quotas and numbers, at best, I make no difference, but normally I tend to make things worse. And we create the opposite of what we intend. So we end up reinforcing the patterns that we don't want. We create more polarization. We create almost more stereotypes and unconscious bias. And so in human systems, what we need to understand is that, diversity, while it involves similarities and difference, it's also about the way that these similarities and differences are perceived, interpreted, and acted upon. And very often these interpretations and actions are informed by unconscious dynamics and biases. I very often spend time in group relations conferences where we almost explore the unconscious, quite deliberately. And I am very often surprised just by how deeply rooted some of these biases and these ways of seeing each other, how deeply rooted those are. And it's only when we're able to be in conversation, to almost sit in the messiness and sit in the fire, because sometimes it can be deeply uncomfortable. But if we can be there together for long enough, that is when things start shifting. And, we need to realize that, diversity is much more complex, much richer and much more nuanced than we tend to make it. So here in South Africa, very often we focus on almost want to say the primary diversity attributes, so it's things like race and gender and age, typically all the isms, ageism and racism, all of these, we tend to focus on those. But then there's so many other things, there's neurodiversity, there's geographical distribution here. We're such a deeply unequal society, that you can't just assume, for example, that everybody has access to technology or knows how to use it. Even something like access to Wi-Fi here is a very, particular diversity marker. And we tend to just forget about those. And then there are other things, specifically in organizations, like the level in a hierarchy, our years of tenure, things like our tolerance for risk. There's so many things that that make up similarities and differences. And so it's so nuanced that we can't just try and make things fit into categories. And then the complex human systems that we are part of, they are made up of multiple dynamic variables that are connecting and interacting in ways we can't fully know. This is one of the things, that entanglement. I think COVID-19 has given us a bit of a masterclass in this. But even incidents, for example, like the Ever Given, the big cargo ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal earlier, it highlighted for us how interconnected our world is and how things are connected in ways that we may not even have realized. So if we do something in one part of a system, it can ripple through the entire system and create effects in a completely different kind of a part of the system that we didn't anticipate. They also open and they're adapting to their environment. So a key thing with a complex system, and I think we all know this, intuitively, is it's constantly changing. It is constantly learning, evolving, and shifting. And if we end up being over-optimized or, too fit, if I use an ecosystem term, for a particular context, it can be very dangerous. And typically what this looks like, especially in our world where we are, quite in love with efficiency, for example, is that we strip the redundancies out of our organizations. Typically, this leads to more homogeneity, so we end up with not enough diversity. And if we all think alike, when the context around us shifts, as happened with Kodak, then we kind of all go down together. So if we can't predict what will happen next, we need a certain requisite level of diversity so that we know that somewhere somebody will be able to respond. And I want to share an example from a completely different context. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this. This might be bad news if you like bananas, but they are also facing a pandemic. And the reason for this is that nearly all of the bananas that are cultivated and sold globally are of one variety. It's called the Cavendish. And it's even worse than that. They're not only of the same variety, they are exact clones. So they don't produce seeds, they are cloned. And because they are perfect genetic copies, they all share exactly the same vulnerability. And this is to a deadly fungus that in the 50s wiped out their predecessor. And so now there's an entire multi-billion-dollar banana industry and an entire supply chain that has been set up around a single variety of banana that is very highly at risk. And the same happens in human systems. If we're all too similar, we share the same vulnerabilities, and we are not able to adapt when the need arises. And so diversity is not a necessary evil. It is not a problem to solve. It is a crucial precondition for adaptive capacity in a complex world, for resilience, so that when things go wrong, we are able to adapt and respond in an appropriate way. And interestingly enough, for belonging. And I think sometimes we know that we need to cultivate and nurture diversity, but we forget about some of the other things, like, for example, ideas or notions like talent management and building a talent pipeline. If we don't know what we will need in 5 or 6 years from now, I tend to think we don't even necessarily know what skills we'll need in 2 years from now. How do we identify the talent that we need to be developing now? Those people that we tend to dismiss now as not part of the talent pool may be exactly the people we need in a year or two. So we need to radically rethink the way that we categorize people and the way it plays out in our organizations in things like talent management. But let's just look a little bit more deeply at this notion of belonging. So sense of belonging in itself is complex. And over the last year, many of my clients, expressed a concern that with hybrid work and, people no longer being in the office, that their culture of inclusion and the sense of belonging was being compromised. And so we got really interested to see what these dynamics were. And so we did quite a number of narrative inquiries in organizations around the world to see if we can better understand this. And one of the really interesting things that we found, and this is known in the theory, but it came out very strongly in the narratives, is that people navigate a multiplicity of belongings. And it's linked to our roles and our identities. So at the same time, I belong to a family, I belong potentially to a community, to a hobby group, to a work group, even, to people who share my values, or to an online group with a certain belief. And in a non-hybrid world, whereas in the past we could navigate all of these different belongings, we could make transitions between them through rituals, things like commuting to work, or changing our clothes, or, buying a coffee somewhere. Now, all of a sudden, we no longer have those, and all of these belongings are thrown together into one physical space. So space also plays quite a big role here. And this creates an overwhelming tension, sometimes between competing belongings. People feel pulled in different directions. This is almost another form of diversity, the number of diverse roles and belongings that you need to juggle. And so what happens often is that in an attempt to escape this tension and to manage our sense of being overwhelmed, we unconsciously seek others like us. And this could be people who think like us, people who look like us, but we tend to try and make our lives a little bit more simple by, sticking together in a way. And so the circle of belonging narrows, and sometimes it narrows to a point that it's no longer healthy. And so in our projects, we started to look at, can we create, almost a landscape of belonging, and what is the role of diversity? And where we ended up was with this landscape. And I'll show you now kind of examples of what it looks like when we apply a narrative lens to this. But what we found that was really interesting is if we look at the level of, or the strength of belonging, so how strongly do I feel I belong on the horizontal axis, from low sense of belonging to very high. And then I look at the levels of diversity, or we're calling it contradictory complexity. So, is there many different perspectives, many different ways of looking at things? Is there enough diversity? Low and then also high. What we found was that if there's a really high level of contradictory complexity or diversity and a low sense of belonging, then we get fragmentation and a loss of coherence. On the other hand, if we have a really, really strong sense of belonging, but we have a low diversity, then we get rigidity and polarization. And we can see a lot of this happening in the world right now. We can see it with vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers. We can see it in so many areas in the world where we've become so polarized, and that it's almost like a collapse of sense making. On the other hand, if we have very low complexity as well as, very low sense of belonging, and actually if we've got very low sense of belonging, regardless of the amount of diversity, we tend to end up with groupthink, blind spots and brittleness, and also isolation, low engagement and retention. So this dynamic between diversity and a sense of belonging is really, really important. And we wanted to see if we could map this using narratives or stories, which this conference is about. And so we used a distributed ethnographic method. An example would be SenseMaker. I don't know if you've come across it. It's software that was developed by Professor Dave Snowden. And this helps us make narrative ecologies of belonging visible. And I put a definition up there for you because this is such an interesting analogy for me. So if we move from the idea of a landscape of belonging to seeing what does a narrative ecology, a narrative landscape look like? Yanis Gabriel wrote a wonderful article on this where he speaks about narrative ecologies being an analogy. And the same way that we find deserts or monocultures or temperate zones with diverse forests in the natural world, the same happens in human systems with stories. So there are some organizations, some human systems where there are almost no narratives. Or there's only a single dominant narrative and no alternative narratives are almost allowed. They're not giving breathing space. And then there are jungles where there's so many competing narratives that we struggle to make sense. And then there are these narrative temperate zones where there's just enough diversity to make things interesting and to create resilience and a creative tension. And so what we try to do is to see if we could map these. And so what you're seeing on screen now is an example of such a narrative ecology. So this is an example that we found in one of our clients that shows, almost a polarization. We had two very dominant narratives, and you can see it with these two different color clusters. And it's interesting because there's very few spaces where they overlap, and there were no other clusters emerging here. So there weren't any alternative stories. There was a cluster of very kind of negative stories where people felt that they weren't valued, where there wasn't enough inclusion, they didn't feel that they belong, and they were disengaged. And then there was another cluster, and you can see examples of some of the stories that sit underneath this landscape. Where people really longed to be back together. They could see the value of diversity. They felt that the organization looked after them. And it was really interesting because it was as if these two groups worked in completely different organizations. And so this is an example of what it looks like when belonging almost becomes unhealthy. When we feel that we're sucked into a pattern of narrative, a belonging where, there's not enough diversity and our thoughts aren't being challenged. And then this is an example of a more healthy and diverse narrative ecology. And you can see there are many areas of overlap. There are three main clusters, but if we slice the data a bit differently, we would get more, granular and more kind of emergent clusters. And so what this showed us, and I found it, quite counterintuitive. I knew that there would be a link between diversity and belonging, but I didn't understand how strongly it featured. And what I really didn't understand is that a requisite diversity is a precondition for healthy belonging. So sometimes even when we focus on creating inclusive cultures and we focus so much on inclusion and belonging, but we forget about creating or being open to a broader set of diversity, we might end up with belonging, but it may not be a healthy form of belonging, and things may start to become rigid and ossified. And so to summarize, to be fit for complexity, to be able to adapt in this complex world of ours, we need to reframe diversity as an asset and not a problem. And this means we need to adopt new language, we need to adopt new thinking. We need to broaden our view of diversity, and we need to acknowledge the nuance and the messiness and the beauty of it. And then thirdly, we need to shift from such a strong focus on alignment and culture fit to focusing on creating more of a messy coherence. So there's a little bit of messiness, but it makes sense together. We are not fragmenting. We can still see that we're part of the same organization, but we're allowing for diversity in terms of how our culture is expressed. A healthy sense of belonging and creating a requisite diversity. And this will potentially impact on many things like how we recruit, how we do talent management, all of these things. And then I want to end with this quote by Ron Heifetz. He wrote a book, The Art of Adaptive Leadership. And he said, conflict is the primary engine of creativity. And that people don't learn by staring into a mirror, they learn by encountering difference. And so I want to encourage, and I'm speaking to myself as well, to build, to flex that muscle, to be in the discomfort of this tension, where we're rubbing up against people and belief systems that are not like our own, and to be curious and not show up with judgment. And that is it from me. I'm not sure how this works. If you open for questions.
Thank you, Sonia, so much. It was amazing. So an invitation to embrace complexity and what it brings with it. And maybe we have one question, because at 2 p.m. the next session round is starting. And so if you want somebody who has a question to tell, maybe unmute your microphone. And no questions. I look up in the chat.
Yeah, feel free also to just, connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn and burning question that we didn't have any time for.
But many thanks. It was very inspiring. It was amazing. And how you work with narratives, incredible. So thank you for this input. And so we take this into the next session round. I hope that you be around the rest of the day, maybe.
Yes, I'm going to be in and out. So I see there's a request to just quickly show the
Sure.
the narrative ecology again. I'll just, I think this is what they wanted to see. I'll just leave it up if you want to take a screenshot. I'm happy to share the slides as well if you just pop me a message.
Great. Thank you so much. And
thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day and all the networking, and thank you again for inviting me.
yeah.